Hello, souls and demons, and welcome back to the portal. Today I have 2 stories for you. So sit back, grip your seats, and enjoy yourselves. The cult I'm a part of doesn't give second chances. Written by Unknown Reading YouTube. You haven't lived long enough to experience true pain. It was a mantra I'd heard countless times from our leaders before they took your offerings. Those words were spoken, followed by the blade being dragged over the limb that was the most healed. This usually meant that the blade reopened a wound that had just scabbed over and began the healing process. All of the members were a patchwork of fresh cuts, scabs, and scars. But we did it because we were told it was right. I'm surprised, knowing what I know now, that there wasn't mass cases of infections and deaths. I'm not sure if the others ever questioned anything, but I did. Often. Were we not entitled to our own blood? Why was it taken from us on such a regular basis? Surely they couldn't go through that much blood in such a small amount of time. With our family at over 100 members, it was hard to imagine they did anything besides take our blood and toss it out the back door. Did the others think of this? I didn't think so. Those kinds of questions are dangerous for cult members. The others were blind followers, some literally having given up their eyes to show their commitment to the family. But I was different. I knew I was. I had been with the family for my whole life, being adopted by a couple who was already part of the cult and who taught me from a young age the cult tenets. Once I was a full member, I appeared to be a model sister, following the rules, not drawing attention to myself. Inside, however, I was looking for a way out. My 18th birthday was coming up, and that meant the family would be expecting me to bear a child. I had planned to leave before that happened. Our most sacred duty of the day was our bloodletting. We would shuffle up in smaller groups to the altar room at our specific time. We all wore our special gown. It amounted to little more than charcoal-colored tank top and shorts that most would say came up too high. This was done to make sure it was easy to reach any spot on the body in order to cut. They drained us of our life force, making us woozy and weak. Perfect for corralling us like beasts to the slaughter. My body may have been weak and tired, but my mind was sharp and keen, always searching for weaknesses and ways to escape. When we weren't giving away our life essence, we were doing menial tasks throughout the complex. There were various machines throughout, their pipes reaching upward through the ceiling to freedom, while we oiled and maintained their vital parts at their base. Each section of the family was responsible for a handful of machines whose purpose was given no thought to by most. I figured some were used to control the temperature, while others had loud fans in them, maybe to draw in air, but I've never been able to figure out their real purpose. Remember, children, you haven't lived long enough to experience true pain. Slice. My arm had nearly healed when it was recut open. The leaders were known as the grandfathers. They were never seen without their all-white gowns, which went down past their feet, dragging as they walked. After bloodletting ceremonies, their white and pure gowns would be stained a dark and deep velvety red. The grandfather ruled with an iron fist, and I never heard of them giving second chances. A devout member came to the altar to give his offering of blood when he was sick. Just before the blade had cut him, he doubled over coughing. The grandfather didn't hesitate. "Sinner!" he screamed, plunging the blade deep into the man's shoulder and jerking it around until he and everyone around him was covered in blood. This served me as a warning. If I failed to escape, there would be no forgiveness. I stumbled back to my dorm that day in a daze, both from the recent events and from the blood I had lost from the large new cut going down my forearm. This policy of no forgiveness was very effective at stopping possible rebellions. Even if there were others that thought like me, I could never know for fear of being killed. The more I think about it, the more I am both impressed and disgusted by the grandfathers. Another powerful deterrent was the place we lived. Through a few tests, I was able to conclude that it was definitely underground. The walls were solid, and the air was constantly recycled. The damp corridors were always dimly lit, projecting an air of calm obedience over everyone. I planned and I searched, but the bunker in which we were located in seemed to be a labyrinth. Only the grandfathers knew how to get out. They were the ones who brought us our food and water, and they were the ones who guided new blindfolded members down. They had perfect control over our ecosystem, and they were the apex predators. One day, while giving my blood, I felt a slight draft coming from somewhere. If I hadn't been searching for something abnormal in that moment, I might have missed it. But it was unmistakably a draft. With blood still fresh on my bloodletting gown, I decided that the altar was the best place to look for an exit. If I was going to leave, it needed to be soon. My birthday was approaching, and I didn't want them to be focusing on me while I was trying to escape. Days passed, my cuts multiplied, and I honed in on where I thought the draft was coming from. I knew I didn't have much time left and decided that I would go within a week. If I died, at least I wouldn't have to have a baby with some brainwashed cult member. And if I got away, I could start a new life somewhere else. Then, like a freight train hitting a car that thought it had enough time to cross without being hit, I thought of another problem. I didn't know where we were. I knew we were in America. Before my foster parents had switched me to homeschooling, I had learned how to read and write in school as well as basic geography. There was no way of knowing for sure where in America I was. I just hoped it was a part that spoke the same language as me. I tried not to get hung up on this. I could find somewhere to go once I got out. If I got out. I didn't plan every detail. I knew once it started all my planning would change and I would need to adapt. But I looked for places to hide in case my attempt failed. I stashed some food bundled up in a shirt at the end of a particularly dark and gloomy hallway I had never seen anyone go down. Just in case. I planned out routes that took me away from the main areas. I memorized where places I could go to hide at were and if they decided to search for me. Finally, I made the decision that if they found me, I would try as hard as I could to not get taken alive. I knew what they wanted me for, and I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The day finally came. All my plans were at the front of my mind. The previous day I'd walked to all of my points one last time to make sure I knew the way and could get there without much thought. My nerves must have shown on my face, but I hoped it would be seen as excitement when I approached the altar to give my blood. I just had to stay alive till the night, and I could get out of there. I strode towards the altar with a confident and happy stride. Nerves racked me, but I was sure of one thing. This would all be coming to an end soon. "There are sinners among us," the grandfather cried out from the altar. He produced a shirt with food wrapped in it. I was at the base of the altar with the rest of the people in my section, and every face fell simultaneously. If one of us failed, then we all failed. The door to the room slammed shut behind us, and in the vacuum I felt it once more. A breeze. With the door closed, I could tell that it was coming from directly behind the grandfather standing on the altar. He stood there, shirt in hand, pure white gown rippling slightly. Whether it was from the breeze or if he was so angry he was shaking, I couldn't tell. I was so distracted and encapsulated by the man above me at the altar, and by the cries of those around me proclaiming their innocence, that I almost didn't hear the gurgling coming from the other end of the line. I turned and looked at the other end, just in time to see the bloodletting blade sink deep into the back of one of the older sisters. She stiffened where she stood, blood trickling out of her mouth and pouring out of her back. She let out a small cry which turned into a choked sob as she fell forward, sliding off the blade. The grandfather who committed the stabbing then moved to the next person, who was too distraught and begging for forgiveness from the grandfather on the altar to notice the silent killer stride up behind him and plunge his blade into his back. Already 5 lay dying on the ground, and I knew they wouldn't stop at me, even if they had special plans in store for me on my birthday. Every one of my plans had been ruined in just a few seconds. I weighed my options and found that the only one I really had was to go for it. To my knowledge, there was only one ritual blade, so if I could get past the grandfather on the altar quick enough, I could make it out. This is not how I wanted to do this. Stealing my courage, I took 3 deep breaths and charged forward. The grandfather on the altar must never have dreamt this would happen, since the look on his face would have been comical in any other circumstance. I ran right at him. He towered over me, but in the surprise of it all, I was able to easily push through him and make my way to the back of the altar. There, behind a cleverly hid wall that was more forward than the rest to hide the doorway, was a staircase leading me to freedom. The tunnel had very few lights in it, and those that I could see were so dim that if it hadn't been so dark, I would have missed them. Along the walls to my left ran a series of pipes, unmarked and bare, guiding my path up to the surface. To my right was a groove in the flood with a chain on it. I would later find out that it was a cart that was used for food and water to be brought down. I ran up, taking 2 steps at a time. The scabs and cuts on my legs tore open as I went, leaving my legs a bright red and making perfect outlines of my feet on the stone-cold floor. I didn't want them to be able to track me, so I resolved to do something about it when I got to the surface. Ascending rapidly, I found a gentle bend in the stairway. Once around it, I saw a vertical strip of light. Pushing the double doors open, I found that I was on a long tiled corridor. I completely forgot about my plan to stop making footprints once I heard it. A genital roar of what sounded like people talking and feet hitting the floor. Stealing one last glance at the door I came out of to make sure I wasn't followed, which I wasn't. I began to make my way to the next set of doors at the end of the corridor. On the door was a simple bolt lock, which I cautiously flipped open and timidly pushed open the door. On the other side was hundreds of people, all walking back and forth. They wore normal clothes, and each of them seemed to be a part of their own world. I burst out the doors, not knowing what else to do, but needing to get as far away from the cult as possible. My sudden movement seemed almost to be my downfall, since all the blood I'd lost from my cuts reopening had begun to catch up to me. I stumbled forward, almost hitting the floor, before being caught by a man wearing all white shoes, gray sweatpants, and a jacket with a plus sign on it. He didn't say anything, just stared at my obviously horrifying state. He didn't even notice when my blood began to get on his shoes. Others began to come and try to help him. They wanted to stop the bleeding, but there was too many cuts, and I would have looked like a mummy if they had succeeded. Many people stayed with me and asked me questions while we waited for more professional help. Soon after the police arrived, the building I would learn was called the mall was closed for the day. Learning about a cult operating under a mall seemed pretty serious to the police. I knew that the owners of the mall, or at least a manager, would have to have known about the cult, but I kept that to myself, confident that the police would work it out someday. The raid met the bodies of all the cult members. It was a massacre of biblical proportion. All died by knife. Although I didn't go back down there, I heard that the walls were painted with blood. The grandfathers were never seen again, and I was soon after put into the witness protection program. I was given a new name. Not that I even knew my old one too well, and a new life. I won't divulge any personal information, since I know a cult can work off the simplest thing. If you are in a cult, get out. They are always dangerous and, usually, don't give second chances. I was trapped in a coma for 10 days when the crooked lady appeared and stared into my eyes. By JTB 685. Late one night, long after my family had been sent home, the crooked lady staggered alongside my hospital bed, moving the way you'd expect someone with a broken spine and shattered legs to. I could hear her slow, labored inhales and taste the stench of her breath. She tapped my forehead with a cold finger, pulled my eyelids back, then placed what felt like leeches all over my face. Later, I discovered they weren't normal leeches. They were capped with 3 narrow slits for eyes and a mouth, like a human face at the end of a slimy black strip. As they latched onto me, I felt a strange, chilling sensation, and terror like I'd never known before. All I could do was helplessly lie down and pray for it to end. The crooked lady pulled the leeches off and swallowed them whole. Then she disappeared, leaving me gasping for lungfuls of air. At first I thought it was a nightmare, but she came back the next night, and the next. Sometimes she spoke while she worked, shushing me when I gasped or saying things like, "Almost done," when my body spasmed. Her voice had a hard, raspy texture to it. This continued until one night, after collecting the leeches, she looked into my eyes again. She nodded, stepped back, then whispered, "One more session should do it." This time, the chilling sensation remained after she'd gone. When I woke up, bars of sunlight were cast through the blinds. It was a beautiful day outside, but I still felt cold, numb. I pushed the emergency call button on the side of my bed. A minute passed, then several. I mashed the button again and again. Nothing happened. I rolled out of bed and fell to the floor. It felt like my legs hadn't been used in years. Resting on a chair in the corner was a baseball bat and a card from my daughter. It read, "Get well soon, Daddy. I left you my lucky bat to help you get better faster." My daughter had called it her lucky bat since she hit 2 game-winning home runs with it back-to-back. Since I was too busy with work, I'd missed both. All I could think about was seeing my family again. I stumbled to the hall and tried calling for help, but my mouth was so dry I could barely manage a whisper. I made my way to the nurse's station and collapsed in front of 2 doctors. They continued with their conversation like I wasn't even there. It sounded like they were speaking underwater. At first I thought I was dreaming, or having a crazy hallucination, but as the dizziness passed, I became more aware of my surroundings. The patients complaining, the sterile smell. It felt too real, it couldn't be a dream. But something was wrong. The ward and everything in it looked like it had been taken from an old, discolored photo and shrouded in mist. I shook doctors and pushed nurses with what little strength I had, but they all ignored me. Solid objects barely moved when I tried picking them up or knocking them aside. It was like being trapped behind an invisible barrier, unable to manipulate the world. I'd become a ghost. As naive as it sounds, I believed my family would be able to see me, and that if I could just make it home, everything would be okay. It was like stumbling through fog. Every so often I collide with an echo of the world and use it to guide my way. When I finally arrived, I tried calling my wife's name. She spun around and smiled. For a moment I thought she'd seen me, but then my daughter walked past and hugged her mom. I slumped back against the wall, watching them sit down to eat, completely oblivious to my presence. For hours I tried making them notice me. I held my daughter in my arms and felt the warmth of her breath against my cheek. A flicker of recognition flashed across her face. "It's me," I cried. "I'm here, I love you." Her lip trembled. My wife asked what was wrong. "I was thinking about Daddy." I broke down and sobbed. I couldn't resign myself to this. There had to be a way back. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew the crooked lady was responsible. If she stayed true to her word, she'd be paying me one last visit. Perhaps there was a way to undo whatever she'd done. It wasn't a great plan, but it was all I had. I took one last look around the house, memorizing every detail. I kissed my daughter on the forehead and said, "I love you." She shivered as a tear ran down her cheek. I made my way back to the hospital and waited. Hours passed. From the quiet of the hall, I heard the unsteady steps. My throat tightened as they grew closer. I peeked behind the door just in time to see the crooked lady burst forward, knocking me clean across the room. "You weren't supposed to wake up," she groaned. I lay on my back, winded. She reached out to grab me, but I caught her withered wrist with both hands. With the devil's strength, she thrust it towards my neck and touched her fingertips to my throat. Darkness crept to the edge of my vision. I pushed my feet against her chest and kicked with all my strength. She collided with a bedside monitor and fell to the ground. When she stood, I got my first proper look at her and retched. Her torso was misaligned from her legs, and her jaw from the rest of her head. She charged, arms outstretched and elbows facing the wrong way, revealing more bends and twists than any human should ever have. She grabbed my throat and pinned me against the wall. My toes barely scraped the floor. The leeches slithered down her arm and onto my face. One lingered on her hand for a moment and stared. The horrible sensation returned, more intense than ever before. An indescribable pain. I drove my thumbs into the crooked lady's eyes, but my hands started fading away. She smiled at my panicked reaction. In a last desperate effort, I tried to pry her hands off my throat. I touched something slimy. It was a leech. I pulled it off my neck and squeezed as hard as I could. It made a disgusting squelch. The crooked lady wheezed and groaned. It hurt her. I grabbed another one. She pulled me back and slammed me against the wall, hard. There was a moment of blinding pain as my vision blurred. Then a trickle of blood ran down my forehead. I kept hold of the leech and pinched it between my finger and thumb. Squelch. Her grip loosened. She shrieked in pain and I was free. I snatched more leeches off my face and crushed them. The crooked lady staggered and whirled around, roaring curses. She flailed her arms, knocking both me and a ventilator clean across the room. The ventilator collided with the chair in the corner and knocked it over. My daughter's bat fell onto my lap. I could touch it. I wiped blood from my eyes and scrambled to my feet as the crooked lady twisted her head right around to face me. I swung the bat straight into her nose. She hissed and spat. She lurched forward but was too slow. I swung in a downward arc and smashed the crown of her head. I followed her around the room, landing more blows. She made a sound like a cat coughing up a fur ball, then vomited a torrent of sticky black bile. It spewed from her mouth like a fountain. Trapped in it were more leeches. They tried crawling towards me but were stuck in the black substance, a few threads of which were still hanging out of the crooked lady's mouth. I stomped. She groaned. I stomped again and again. She writhed and contorted worse than before. Steam rose from her body and she wailed like a banshee. Now I'd returned to normal, but she was the one fading away. There was only one leech left, but nauseous from my injury, I fell onto my back and dropped the bat. A hospital light spun above my head. The crooked lady crawled on top of me and raised a hand to my throat one last time. I fumbled for the last leech and found it, and squeezed. The last thing I remember was a nurse running into the room. When I woke up, my family was at my side. After a tearful reunion, a doctor walked in with a furrowed brow. He wanted to know how I'd managed to wake up from a coma, split my head open and trashed the room, all without being noticed. For a moment, I considered telling him the whole ordeal, but decided against it. So far as I could tell, they'd found no trace of the crooked lady. I played dumb, told them I couldn't remember a thing. They blamed it on the coma. When the nurse said it was time to get some rest, my daughter gave me one last hug. She squeezed so hard I couldn't breathe, but I didn't complain. I thanked her for leaving me her lucky bat and told her I was sorry for missing her games, and promised it would never happen again. As she walked away, I shouted, "I love you." I can't even begin to describe the joy I felt when she turned around, looked him in the eye and replied, I love you too, Daddy.